Boom, boom, boom. This is The Leading Edge, and I'm your host, Osama Siddiqui. Joining us on today's show is Aun Ansari, a fellow cricket enthusiast based out of Canada. Welcome, On.
Thank you, Sama. Pleasure to be here.
On just very quickly, what's it like following cricket in Canada, where there's not so many people to discuss it with, and time difference probably makes an issue as well.
Well, time difference definitely does make it a bit challenging, but in my experience, I still find this easier than watching a Pakistan series happening down under in Australia while living in Pakistan. Typically, when you're staying in Pakistan and you're watching any series in Australia or New Zealand for that matter, matches typically start around 3 a.m., 3:34 a.m. Pakistan time. Here I felt a lot of the matches are starting around 5:30, 6:30 a.m., which given that we were just in Ramadan, made it a little easy. So you get up, you have seri, you still have about an hour or so to kill, and then you get into the World Cup fever. Um, on your question around having other people to kind of enjoy the game with, you'd be surprised by how big the cricket viewing community is in Canada here. There are a lot of Pakistanis, even more coming in, every few months. And then with the digital age and social media advent, it's pretty much made it a global village, right? Like you're watching the match on the screen, and then you're tweeting away and really enjoying that experience with people from all across the world.
Okay, okay. So you've been following the World Cup closely then.
Yeah, as closely as I could with work and everything
So
around.
what do you make of the first week? Any interesting trends, things that have surprised you? What's your take on the first week of the World Cup?
So, what's surprised me is actually the surprise people have shown on Bangladesh's, victory over South Africa, and just generally the strong showing that they've posed. Because I don't know why people are so surprised. This is a team that has been consistently performing well, not just in Asia, but also abroad. If you look at their squad, they've got players that are experienced, they've got a balance of youth in their bowling lineup with, the exciting talent of Mustafizur coming in and Mehdi Hassan in the spin department. Plus, they've got experience in Tamim, Shakib, Rahim, and then a very astute captain. So I'm not surprised by their performance. I'm actually surprised by people calling them as, calling their victory against South Africa as an upset. I think that's doing injustice to the consistency with which they've been performing of
I
late.
think I agree. Bangladesh, people forget they reached the semifinals of the last champion trophy. They're in the finals of the Asia Cup. They've been winning series at home. They've been contending in series away. It's the same unit pretty much for the last 5 to 7 years. And then South Africa, even, I talked about it in my show last week. They were an undercooked team that, three Lungi Ngidi, Kagiso Rabada, Dale Steyn, all were struggling with niggles from the IPL. Dale Steyn has now been ruled out of the World Cup. Their batting lineup was
Yeah.
unsure. Amla's going through the worst patch of his career. So yeah, I think Bangladesh beating South Africa, even maybe by the bookmakers, it was an upset, but the cricket community shouldn't be too surprised. Um,
That's right. And I think what you've touched upon here, Osama, is another interesting point regarding injuries and the IPL, right? I mean, Faf mentioned it in a press conference before the India match where he said, who knows where we would have been had Dale Steyn not gone to IPL, right? And I don't think that's something that's talked about enough in world cricket about, so close to a major event where you ideally want to give your top players some breathing space, some rest. I understand the commercial aspect of going to the IPL, but in a World Cup year, might not have been the smartest move on the part of Dale Steyn
but do
and
those
some other
rules
players as
only
well.
apply for bowlers? I mean, Faf played the whole IPL himself.
No, I agree, right? Like, I mean, injury could happen to anyone, and It's in case of FAF, it's a bit about the pot calling the kettle black here. Having said that, I think the principle applies to all, right? Like India and BCCI have been able to pull their weight and make sure that there's no international match, World Cup or otherwise, with after at least 15 days of the completion for IPL. So they've kind of leveraged their muscle and made sure that their players have enough time to recuperate and recover and relax it out. Other countries obviously don't get that privilege. And they're seeing some after effects of it almost immediately in a tournament like the World Cup where their top players are not fit.
I think boards have to make a call in that except for West Indies, maybe where their big players aren't essentially contracted. With all the other teams, these players essentially contracted. It's up to the board to manage. Maxwell didn't play the IPL this year. Stark didn't play the IPL this year. So Australia prioritized the World Cup. Other teams, they could have done it too. But I know it's a sensitive issue for South Africa because, anytime they'll kind of trample on players' rights and, they risk losing players to callback deals. So
Yeah,
it's a balance for South Africa as well. But yeah, I think that's a fair point. What is IPL doing to the global game?
hmm
I think another thing I'd like to touch on, and I'd like to take your view. We saw in the first few games, Sri Lanka against against New Zealand, Pakistan against West Indies, where the first team was bundled out for a low score, but the team batting second went all out, and on what seemed like helpful conditions for bowlers, they still achieved run rates of 7, 8, and made quick work of the total. But today's two games, you had middling to low totals, which it seemed was a struggle for the team chasing to get there. India, okay, they always look comfortable, but they chased 220 in about 46, 47 overs. New Zealand looked comfortable, but then struggled at the end to get to 240. What do you make of that? Is that something that you think is going to continue in the World Cup, or should we consider today's two games an anomaly?
I think that's a great question, right? And the way I see it is if you recall about, 8, 9, 10 years ago, there was a saying that, if a team scores 150 odd, it's always a tricky chase because it used when 250 was considered to be a winning score almost across conditions. You'd say a 150 chase was always tricky and teams batting second were not quite sure about whether to go all out, guns blazing, and attack, or to play it by the ear and kind of take a stable and defensive approach. My perspective here is that in today's day and age where scores are touching upwards of 300, the 240 to 50 score is actually the trickier chase now. And I think when you set such a target, you almost put the team batting second in two minds as to what is the approach that they need to take. And it's more of a mental game than a drastic change in conditions.
But if you
That's
see, India
yeah.
didn't seem in two minds. I mean, they knew what they were doing, so I found that surprising. It's not like the game, it's not like New Zealand, Bangladesh, where New Zealand were coasting, then they lost quick wickets,
Yeah.
and that slowed them down. India just seemed to know, okay, we're going to take it slow from the get go. That
So
surprised me.
I think what influenced India's decision was actually when they were bowling and how the pitch was behaving. So if you saw the pitch, it wasn't your regular pitch. I mean, it looked pretty white, but there was a bit of grafting on it, right? And the first spell of Bumrah, the dismissals of Amla and then Quinton de Kock, the extra bounce that Bumrah was getting out of the pitch, um, almost I think the Indian batsmen while looking at their bowling, set the tone for their own innings. To say that, look, we're going to be a bit cautious here. It's not a huge total, so there is really no need to go out guns blazing. And then I think the dismissal of Kohli, some of the balls that he got up front from Rabada, the delivery that Dhawan got up front. In fact, Rohit himself was fairly lucky in the first few overs, right? I think that spongy bounce on the wicket set the tone up for them to be a bit more conservative in their approach, and I think that's fair, right? Like a 240 odd total for them to be conservative across on a first game of the World Cup. You're better. err on the side of caution than go out and make a point by
I
being
think we'll
aggressive.
probably, off the big teams, we'll continue to see that from India. They might take each chase kind of by the ears, see what's needed. But we know England go all out all the time. Australia kind of go all out all the time. New Zealand like to attack up front. West Indies like to attack up front. So I think it's maybe more of an India thing. New Zealand also did would have chased it down in 40 overs if it wasn't for the
Yeah.
wickets. So maybe it's more of an Indian approach than any trend that we can ascribe to this World Cup. The other thing is, what do you think? The highest successful run chase in ODI World Cup. So it has been, I think it was about 330 odd.
Mhm.
If you had, looking at ODIs the last few years, looking at conditions in England, especially in bilateral series over the last few years, I would have thought that record would have been smashed at least two or three times over this World Cup.
So
It hasn't happened yet. Do you think it's going to happen, or is it just in a World Cup chasing 300 is much tougher than chasing 350 in a bilateral series?
Absolutely, you hit the nail on the head there, right? Like, I mean, I don't personally. I think you can give the same pitch, same conditions, same teams, but just to change the context from a bilateral series to a World Cup, and you will see a very different outcome coming out. I think it's all nice and well when England was and Pakistan as well were putting up scores of 340, 350 odd and chasing them down in a bilateral series. World Cup is a completely different ball game. There is just so much on the line in this format where every game matters so much that teams will be circumspect in going all guns blazing. And into my mind, I know everybody's kind of put England across as favorites, and rightfully so, right? Like man to man, you compare their power against any other team in the world, and you would say England is, at least a notch above everyone else, maybe even ahead of India.
Definitely, without doubt.
But having said that, my fear for them is they have inculcated that squashbuckling approach in their DNA. And when push comes to shove, when they feel the pressure of a knockout game or come across a pitch that's doing a little bit or a bowling attack that's completely on song that day, do they have the temperament to really hold back and do the grind in their batting? That's a question mark in my mind.
I think that's going to be an interesting thing to look about, to see with the England team. I think not necessarily with the approach, but so far, in their what I call their ODI revolution of the last 4 years, they have preferred to chase. And this the game against Pakistan was the first game after 19 consecutive successful run chases at home. They lost the 20th. So let's see, going ahead, if they win the toss, do you think they're going to continue to chase, or they might change that strategy and try to bat first given the World Cup
I
pressures?
think they'll be comfortable chasing for sure. I think they back themselves up to do that. But whether they bat first or bat second, I think uh, barring Joe Root, who's the linchpin of the lineup and as a glue, we see a lot of other players belting under pressure, right? Like they pride themselves in Ben Stokes. I know you had him up as an MVP in your previous episode. But I think Ben Stokes, time and again, is someone who's fallen flat in the eye of pressure, right? And World Cup is going to be one of those that platform where he will continuously be tested against that pressure with tougher teams to come.